In this demonstration, we're going to talk about working with layouts in ArcGIS Pro. So I've got a project that I've already opened in ArcGIS Pro, and initially we're going to take a look at this from the perspective of already having created a layout. The layout that you see in my project at this time essentially contains a layout that I imported from an existing map document file. So this layout was imported over from some work that I had done in ArcMap in the past. The import process, moving a layout from ArcMap to ArcGIS Pro, is a pretty seamless process. There's a built-in import function that allows you to import directly from ArcMap to ArcGIS Pro. And so using that functionality, I've imported the layout that you see here. So what we want to take a look at first is a layout from the perspective of a layout having already been created. And what we're going to do is talk about some of the elements that you can add to a layout, and then later on in the demonstration, we'll show you how to create new layouts from scratch. So there are two tabs that are primarily used when working with layouts in ArcGIS Pro. We have the Layout tab, which is what is active now, and then there's also an Insert tab. We'll talk about the Insert tab more in detail later. So we'll just kind of start with the Layout tab itself and give you a quick rundown of the ribbon associated with the Layout tab. Starting on the left-hand side, there's a set of clipboard tools that allow you to do cut, copy, and paste operations from the layout. There are navigation tools that allow you to pan and zoom on the layout, much like you would a map. Right? The difference here being that you're working in page space as opposed to map space. The default tool there, though, is the Navigate tool, which allows you to zoom in and zoom out, as you see here, using your mouse. You can also pan side to side in any direction. So very similar to the Explore tool on the Map tab, this Navigate button on the Layout tab is for navigation within the layout itself, so zooming, panning operations. And then there's a set of ancillary tools here that allow you to do different types of navigation within the layout itself. So there's a full extent button, page within, 100%. So a lot of different tools here. Most of these tools are kind of carryovers from what we had in ArcMap. Now, just to the right of that are your elements, the elements group. So this is a set of tools that allow you to select elements. So for example, the default tool allows you to click on an element and select it, as you can see here. Anytime you select an element, it puts the little handles around that element. You can also draw different types of geometries. Right? So you might draw a rectangle, for instance, and anything that intersects that rectangle becomes selected. You can clear your selection. You can select all as needed. And you can see that anytime you select an item on the layout, it becomes selected in the contents pane as well, and vice versa. Right? If you select an element directly on the contents pane, it becomes selected in the layout as well. So just a set of tools here that allow you to work with the elements. Under page setup, you can change the orientation of your layout as needed. There's a tool here that allows you to change the size of your layout. We don't go into map series in this particular demonstration, but this map series tool enables you to enable a map series for your layout. You can hide and show rulers and guides as needed. Next set of tools is for dealing specifically with a map, and these tools are very handy tools here that allows you to work with a map within the context of the layout. So in other words, without having to go back to the original map, I can make changes to any of the maps on directly from the layout itself. And just to kind of give you an example of how this works, right? If I select a map frame on the layout and then I click Activate, you'll notice that it essentially grays everything else out except for the currently activated map frame. And when this is when you have a map frame that's been activated, at that point, then you can make changes, spatial extent changes to that particular map on the layout itself without having to go back to the map to make an extent change. So at this point, then I can zoom in, zoom out, pan, basically reset the extent as needed, and I can do that within the context of the layout, so that I'm not having to go back to the map to make those types of changes. Anytime you get an activated map, you'll get an activated map frame context tab. You click on that, it's a single layout tab, and tools here for navigation, of course, within the map itself. And then at some point, you're going to want to close the activation so that you go back to your regular state. This close activation button will just simply close the activation and reset your layout to its original state. But there's different options here for zooming and panning, in addition to that activate button. Tools that should be familiar to you from having worked with them on the map tab or having worked with this in the in ArcMap. Similar types of tools there. You can also access bookmarks, zoom to specific map views if needed, if you've got specific map skills that you've set. So that's a brief overview of the tools that are found on that layout tab. Now on the layout itself, right, anytime you select an element, you are going to get a related context tab. So you can see at this point I've selected a legend. I get a legend context tab that becomes activated, and it in essence contains one tab. It's going to be the format tab, and that's going to be pretty much the same no matter which element you select, whether it's text or legends or map frames. You're going to get a single format tab tied to that context menu with a set of tools. Not a set of tools, but a set of buttons and tools that allow you to make configuration changes to that particular element. Now, when you have an element selected on your layout, you can also pick it up and move it around to different locations. So it allows you to make changes to the position of that element. You can also change the size as well, right, by dragging as needed. So you can make larger, make smaller, as long as that element is selected, you have the ability to make size and position changes. Now, anytime you select an element in the layout, of course, you get that context tab. You will also get that element selected in the contents pane as well. Same thing applies if you select an element from the contents tab or contents pane. You'll notice it becomes selected on the layout itself. As far as the contents pane itself, there are 4 buttons. The default button is going to be list by drawing order, and that's just going to be a list of all the elements that you've added to your layout and the order in which they will be drawn. Of course, it's a bottom-up type thing, so whatever is on the bottom draws first, whatever's at the top draws last. Other buttons here include list by element type. What that does is it groups things by type. Right? So you can see all the north arrows, all the map frames are all grouped together. Just especially as your layout starts becoming more complex, you start adding more and more elements. Sometimes it's easier to find those elements by going to element type and kind of scrolling through your types that way. The other next button here is list by map frame. So in this case, you can see I have 4 map frames on this particular layout. So I'll have 4 map frames in the list by map frames. And so what this does is it just simply groups all of the elements by map frame. So of course the map itself, any map surrounds, any legends that may be associated with that, right? Those will be grouped there as well. So just another way of kind of grouping the elements that you've added to your layout. We're not going to go into this 4th button here. This is list by map series. We cover that in a separate topic. But that does give you a listing of all the maps that you have generated for a particular map series. Now, for each of these elements, you may have noticed that there's a little unlock icon associated with each of these elements. And just to kind of give you a feel for how that works, anytime an element is in an unlocked state, as you see here, that means that you can make changes to the size and the position for that particular element. So right now I have Crime Legend selected. It's in an unlocked state. It's turned on. You can see it in the layout itself. And so I can make changes, right, positionally. Maybe I want to move it up here, move the legend up to the top, or I may want to change the size a little bit. Right, any of that can be done as long as I'm in an unlocked state. Now, if you click the unlock icon, it'll change to a lock icon. And at this point, it's no longer, that particular element is no longer selectable. Right? You can see if I click on it, it'll select the associated map frame, but I can't actually select the legend itself. And so anytime you lock an element, it just means that you can no longer make changes to the size or the position for that particular element. Now you can always unclick it again if you'd like to unlock it. The reason that this has been implemented is that layouts can take a long time to create and they require a lot of effort. And so once you get to a state where you're confident that that element is in a location and is sized correctly, it makes sense to lock it down so that you don't, or you or somebody else that comes along after you doesn't accidentally move it to a different location, resize it, and introduce some incidental changes that really shouldn't be there. So this locking mechanism allows you to kind of lock things down in place so that you don't have some accidents and accidentally resize it or relocate it when you really didn't mean to do that. Now you can also access an additional set of properties that are associated with these elements by double-clicking the element, either on the layout itself or in the contents pane. When you do that, that opens up the format pane for that particular element. And this is going to be a full listing of all properties that are associated with that particular element. On the context menu, right, we have a set of formatting. We have a formatting ribbon here that allows you to make some changes as well. But the full list of configuration parameters should be in this format pane. So there is some overlap between the configuration parameters that you see in the context tab, as well as what you see in the element pane. So there is overlap between the two. Just know that some of these elements can be changed in either place. However, the full set of properties should be in this format element pane. And you can see in this particular example, I've got 4 buttons. Right now I have the legend selected, so I've got 4 buttons associated with that legend: options, legend arrangement, display options, placement options. So there's a lot going on here. Right? There's a lot of different ways you can configure a legend. And so sometimes you kind of have to search for these things sometimes, right? You have to find the associated configuration parameter that you're looking for to make whatever change you need to make to the configuration for that legend. Sometimes you have to kind of scroll through these and spend some time figuring out where these configuration parameters are. It's not uncommon to get a little bit frustrated with these, especially with some of these more complex elements like legends that have a lot of different configuration parameters. In addition to the legend tab, there's also a text symbol tab across the top. And if you click that, that introduces some additional properties specific to the text symbol that you're dealing with. So appearance, position properties, rotation if you need to introduce a rotation, a lot of different properties here, and then again 2 buttons. So there's a lot going on with these element panes. Every element has a different set of configuration properties. Some are more complex than others. Right? Legends tend to be pretty complex, so there's 4 buttons on legend and 2 on text symbol. But just to kind of show you how that changes if you select a piece of text, text symbols have a far smaller set of parameters that you can set. Right? So there's only 2 buttons here, one for options, one for placement. Right? So it's a far less. There are far less configuration parameters for text than there are legend. So each of these elements have a different set of configuration properties. Some are more complex than others. And again, sometimes you kind of have to dig through these parameters to find the ones that you need to make the configuration changes you need to make for that particular element. And also keep in mind that there is some duplication here. So each of these elements is going to have a context tab for formatting, and then there is some duplication between the configuration parameters you see on the element pane and what you see in the context tab. So that is a quick overview of layouts, just from the perspective of working with a layout that's already been created and going in and accessing the different elements and how you access the properties. Just kind of the basics of what you would typically see in a layout. So I want to switch gears here a little bit and talk about creating a layout from scratch. Now, in ArcGIS Pro, you can create as many layouts per project as you want. There's no limitation there as far as how many layouts you have. If you worked with ArcMap in the past, you have no doubt seen that you are limited in that way. Right? You only have 1 layout per MXD file, but that limitation is not present in ArcGIS Pro. Now, there are 2 ways you can insert a new layout. Well, there's several, but the 2 primary ways of inserting a new layout into ArcGIS Pro are to either go to the catalog pane and go to layouts and right-click on layouts and select new layout. Or if you want to import from an MXD file, you select import. And then an alternative way of doing this is to go to the insert tab and select new layout. And what you'll get there is a nice little gallery that pops up that allows you to select the size of your layout along with the orientation, right? Either portrait or landscape. So in this case, I might want to select something like Architectural E, which is a 36 by 48, right? Pretty large map, 3 feet by 4 feet. What you select here really is going to kind of be governed by what you have access to from a printing standpoint. Right? If you have a nice big plotter, you're going to have a lot more options than you do if you just have an 8.5 by 11 printer. So in this case, we'll just select Architectural E, and that'll create a new layout. You can see that it's added that layout to my project under Layouts with a default name of just Layout. Initially, that layout is just an empty canvas, and then at that point, it's time to start adding content. And we'll just kind of go through some of the basics here. Typically, one of the first things you would do would be to add a map to your layout. And when maps are added to layouts in ArcGIS Pro, they are called map frames. So you can see under the Insert tab, I have a map frame button. Now, before you do that, you do want to set the map frame geometry, which is going to default to a rectangle. So ArcGIS Pro has several options here, including rectangle, polygon, lasso, circle, and ellipse. That just defines the geometry that you're going to draw on the layout for how the map will be placed. So for example, if you select rectangle, then you're going to draw a rectangle on the screen. Just delete that real quick. Whereas if you select a circle, you're going to draw a circle on the screen, and the map will populate inside that circle. So that just defines the geometry that you want to draw on the screen. We'll keep it simple here and just go with rectangle. Now from there, you'll go to Map Frame, and what you see here is the listing of all the maps that are in your current project. I've got a little bit of duplication here just from having worked with it in past presentations. But if you go to the catalog pane, go to Maps, all the maps that you see here will be listed in that map frame gallery. And so it's just a matter of selecting the map frame that you want to use. If you have any spatial bookmarks that have been defined for a map, these will show up here as well. I don't have any right now, but we can kind of take a look at that as well. But essentially, you're going to select the default extent. In this case, is all I really have access to. That is just simply whatever the current extent is for a map that's been set, whatever the default extent is. So in this case, I might just select crime with default extent. And then you do need to draw in the location for where you want the map to go, as well as the size. So you draw that in, and it adds it however you placed it. If you want to make changes to the size or location, you can certainly do that as well. You can move it around. Now from there, you'll typically add additional content. So you might add, for example, a legend. And again, you're just pointing and clicking, and then you do have to draw a little rectangle where you want the legend to go. You'll have to configure those properties. We're not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, but just you'll have to go in here and configure these properties to make it look like you want it to look. Under Map Surrounds, you'll have a set of tools that allow you to place things like north arrows, right, scale bars, legends. If you have any charts that are part of the project, those will show up here under Chart Frames. You can add table frames. Moving on to the right, you can also add graphics and text. That includes static text and dynamic text. Dynamic text is text that you add to a layout that has the ability to update itself. So for example, you might want to add something like the current date and time. So under System, I have something like current time. Place that there. And then each time you print, it's hard to see the date there, it's so small. But what that would do is any time that you print out your layout, or export the layout to something like a PDF file, it's automatically going to update the current date and time. And so sometimes that's it's necessary to have that rather than having to go in there and manually update it. We can use that dynamic text to insert a piece of dynamic text, which will automatically update itself based on current conditions. And you've got a gallery of dynamic text here for pulling dynamic text from the map frame. If you have date and time information on the map frame, it'll pull that in. Coordinate information, system, right, current times, users, layout information, project information, tabular information. Right? You can insert table attributes, table statistics. All that is dynamic text that you can place directly onto the layout itself. Your north arrows, your scale bars, right? You'll have a default set of tools in the galleries here that allow you to insert different types of north arrows and scale bars and different types of arrows. So most of the, when you're adding content to your layout, typically you're going to be doing that from that Insert tab and selecting some of the buttons or tools under Map Surrounds or perhaps under Graphics and Text. That's typically the tools that you're going to use or the map frame itself. Now I want to go back to the map frame and talk about some things here so that you'll get a better feel for what we're seeing here. So you'll notice that when you select the map frame button, you'll always see a default extent for every map. And so let's first kind of describe what that default extent is. So I'm going to open up the crime map. The default extent for a map can be found by going to the contents pane, going to crime, right-clicking, and that'll bring up the map properties dialog box. And you'll see that there's a tab here for extent. And the default extent is going to be whatever you define the default extent as. By default, when you create a new map in ArcGIS Pro, it uses the extent of data in all layers. So what that means is that the current extent is going to be whatever the extent is of all layers in my current map. Now, if you want to customize that, you can go to use a custom extent, and then you can make different, you've got a little bit more options here, right? So it could be the current visible extent, the extent of data in all layers, extent by a particular layer. So you have different options here, and when you select one of these options, you'll notice that your selected extent changes. So that changes here. So for this example, I might want to zoom in to this particular school district. And then under extent, I might want to use the current extent, current visible extent. So what that will do is use whatever your currently selected extent is. In this case, I just clicked on current visible extent. I'll hit OK. Now when I go back to my layout, I'm going to recreate this map. Zoom out a little bit here. Now, I'm going to reset this just a bit. Now when I go to the Insert tab, go to Map Frame, Default Extent, draw it in. Now what it will do is my default extent has changed at this point, right? So at this point, my default extent has changed because I've gone into the map and I've set it. So under crime, I've gone into the properties for that particular map, and I've updated it to set the current extent to whatever my visible extent is. Now you can also set spatial bookmarks as well. So let's just kind of give you a quick example of that. So let's say I wanted to set a spatial bookmark under Lackland ISD. So I could go to bookmarks, create a new bookmark, Lackland ISD. Okay, and now when I go back to my layout and I define a map frame, you'll notice how I have a new option here for Lackland ISD. So if I draw in Lackland ISD at this point, based on the spatial bookmark, it automatically adds that bookmark zoomed, or adds that map zoomed to whatever my spatial extent is. Now you'll notice you also have another option here for just a scale, right, which is 48,505 at this point. That's just whatever your current visible extent is. So if I zoom out a little bit, and that's now going back to 118,418. And the map frame, now you'll notice it's been set to 118,418. So basically that's taking whatever the current map scale is and drawing it in from there as well. So you'll see different options here depending upon what you've done. Every map will have its default extent. That default extent is whatever you have defined as the default extent for the map. It is changeable, as I showed you, so that is something that you can do as needed. So different options there. Anyway, so that's kind of all I wanted to show you for now. So I appreciate you joining me, and until next time, I'll talk to you again.